want you to know that whether you're here for the first time in a long time, or you're here every single week, whether in person or online, that I'm thrilled that you're here, because what we're kicking off today, I think, could be life-changing for you. It's life-changing stuff for me, because the reality of this statement that objects in the rear view rarely stay in the rear view is true. Now, here's the deal. I know that you've got questions about this group of people, especially if you're here for the first couple of times. And I want you to know something really clear and very important about us. This is not a group of people that used to be people like you. And we're not a group of people that just tolerate or put up with people like you. And we're not a group of people who try to fix or change people like you. And you know why? It's because every single person in this room and online has one thing in common, that we all have parts of our story that we regret. There are parts of every one of our stories that we wish we could edit or change, parts I wish I could do over. There are parts of my story that I wish I could go back and like draw a box around and hit the delete key and forget they ever happened. The other thing that we all have in common, you too, right? Every single one of us, is that we all have things in our past that we wish we would just stay there, that they would just stay in our past, right? Forget they happened, move past them. But it's like those stickers on the side of that side mirror on your car. The sticker says, objects in mirror may be closer than they appear. And the truth of it is that the objects in the rear view rarely stay in the rear view. That's what would read on the sticker if it was on the rear view mirror of our lives, is that the things in our rear view mirror very rarely stay in the rear view mirror. They often find their way to the front, don't they? They sneak up on us and they come back in our memories and our feelings and our pain. They come back in our insecurity and our anger and our bitterness. We sort through them all the time, and our past rarely remains in the past. I want to have this relationship with my past and my future where it's like the windshield is my future, right? And this small rearview mirror is the past. I want to have that kind of relationship, a big view of tomorrow and a small view of yesterday. But so often my past sneaks up on me and it winds up becoming the only thing I can see. And I wind up having a windshield size rear view and a tiny little window into the future. God wants more for us than that. He wants more for us than that. And it's something we all want too. I mean, in the early 90s, Meatloaf, still a terrible name for a singer, a great musician. He said this, and though the nightmares should be over, some of the terrors are still intact. I'll hear that ugly, coarse, and violent voice. And then he grabs me from behind, and then he pulls me back. Because the truth of it is the past always has this way of sneaking up on us. And the objects in the rear view rarely stay in the rear view. We wind up dealing with them in our anger, our insecurity, our bitterness, our pain, our constant issues that we deal with, even our tendencies toward depression and anxiety, right? Our story always sneaks up on us, and our past won't remain in the past unless we do something to put it to rest. That's a huge piece. And we're not the only ones, right? It's not just you and me and Americans, and it's not just modern people. It's not just us who are aware of our stories. It's every generation dating all the way back. In fact, one of the most chronicled, one of the most written about characters in the Old Testament, the stories of Israel's beginning, is the story of Saul and his son Jonathan and David. And they became not only a significant part of what is written down in the Old Testament, but they became a significant, in fact, maybe the most significant people in the story of Israel's history. You've heard of King David. He wrote most of the songs. You've heard of King Saul. He was king. He was the very first king of Israel. I mean, these are the biggest stories. Now, here's the story. I wish I could just jump into the end and tell you what I want to tell you, but to understand what really is so important about Saul's story, is how his past somehow snuck up into his present and affected his future, and that's literally where you and I live. But to get there, we got to go all the way back to figuring out how Saul became King Saul. Because Saul didn't become King Saul through an election. He He didn't become King Saul because he was like, really popular guy. He became King Saul in kind of a weird way. You see, God had set aside Israel to be unique in a lot of ways. They were unique in a bunch of different ways. They were uniquely loved and cared for by God. They were protected by God. It was unique among the stories around them. But one thing that wasn't unique about Israel is that Israel wanted to be just like everybody else. They didn't want to be unique. They wanted to be the same. You know how it feels like sometimes when you feel like the odd man out or the odd person out, that you go like, I just want to fit in. I want to have the same kinds of clothes or the same kinds of cars, or I just want to fit in. Well, they wanted to fit in with the nations around them. Every other nation in the area, all their neighbors, had a physical king who was over them. Israel was called by God. God wanted to say, listen, I want you to do differently than they do. I don't want you to have a physical king. I want to be your king. And he told them, listen, I don't want you to have a king, but you can have a king if you want a king. And they were like, we want a king. And so God said, okay, fine. Even though I don't believe it's what's best for you, I'll let you have a king. Isn't that how God is with us? That God is kind and gentle towards us, and he lets us do things that even though that he knows that who we are, he's kind and gentle. And this is the best part, is that he respects us enough as persons, as individuals, to give us the dignity of our own choices. Even when our own choices aren't good for us, he still gives us the dignity of that personhood or causality in our own lives. He does that with them. And so he allows them to choose their own king. They don't choose very well, right? They're already not making good choices. They don't want God to be their king. They want somebody else to be their king. Now, the way things were working before this moment was that God had appointed judges, these different men who would be, or women who would be a judge. They would be a spiritual leader who would help out and kind of guide and direct Israel. The judge that was in charge, or the judge that was kind of leading right now, is a man named Samuel. And Samuel's getting old, and they're getting tired of having a judge, a spiritual leader. They don't want a judge or a spiritual leader anymore. They want a king. And so they're like, hey, Samuel, you're getting old. We're going to choose a king. And so they kind of got their eyes on things that God didn't really care about, right? That wouldn't make a great leader. In fact, they got their eyes on Saul for all the wrong reasons. Let's look at it. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 9. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath. This is a lot of sons. The son of that guy, and Benjamite, a man of wealth. Here's what's important. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he, right? He from his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. That doesn't seem like a really important verse, does it? He's a good-looking dude whose head and shoulders taller than everyone else. But this is the kind of story that Israel wanted to tell for themselves. God didn't want to tell this story. God said, I want to be your king. But they kind of got their eye on Saul because he was handsome and because he's bigger than everybody else. He's literally head and shoulders taller than all of the other people, so they all literally looked up to Saul. The whole nation of Israel got their eyes on Saul because they looked up to Saul. That's such a profound and important thing. It seems so small, right? Because it's just this little thing, but it's not. It's an important thing. Now, fast forward a little bit. This is how Israel chose Saul as king, because he was bigger. Not exactly great leadership qualifications, are they? Now, fast forward. God is so gracious and kind. Because, God lets them choose their own king. God lets them make the poor choices. But God doesn't go, you know what, I'll take my ball and go home. God still tries to lead them and tries to correct them, tries to help them. So he leads them through some really good times. In fact, God gives Saul a mission. And it's a pretty clear mission. Look at this mission. It's Samuel, he gives it through Samuel to Saul. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one that the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people of Israel. So listen to the message that I have from the Lord. God tells Saul through Samuel, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go. Here's the mission. attack the Amalekites, that's hard to say, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Don't spare them. Put to death men and women and children and infants and cattle and sheep and camels and donkeys. Now, if you're like me and you ask questions about stuff you read in the Bible, if you're like me and you kind of like want to manage this question, this tension, man, that seems like a big problem, doesn't it? God tells Saul to go lay waste to the place. Don't spare anyone. I get the men, but then the women, and then I'm like children and infants and cattle and sheep and camels and donkeys. Like, why can't we keep some of them? Why can't we spare some of them? Some of them are innocent, right? Now, see, we would have that question. Why does God call him to do this? But Saul knew exactly why. Because of this sentence that happens before the Amalekites had waylaid people as they came up from Egypt. Now, just to kind of give you a little glimpse into what happened, the Amalekites weren't just, did some mean stuff. God wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for justice. Because what they had done was weird and deeply evil. See, when the nation of Israel is a lot of people, it's not like 15 or 20 people, it's 1 million people or more. And when they traveled out of Egypt up in a line. Like, they just followed the leaders. And you can imagine if you were, leading the nation of Israel, you would lead with the army up front, right? Because that would kind of blaze the trail and get everybody kind of scared. Oh, there's a big army of Israel up front. And they would be able, that up front army would be able to protect the supplies that followed. And the supplies that followed would precede all of the people in the very back of the line who would hold things up, right? You wouldn't put the elderly and the children and the weak up front because they would slow the line down, right? So they put the stragglers back in the back, the army up front. And what the Amalekites were doing was they waited until all of the army went by. And they waited till all the supplies went by. And then they saw the women and the children and the elderly and the sick and the weak. And then they waved to everybody on the way by. And then they came up behind them and they waylaid them as they came up. They came up behind them and killed them. They were just evil people. They weren't really trying to get anything. They were just trying to do damage, just to be evil. God wasn't looking for revenge on the Amalekites. God was bringing justice to them. And God gave Saul a really clear, a very clear picture of exactly what he wanted done. And it's so important that Saul carry out exactly what God wanted him to come. But Saul did it, but just kind of with a few edits, right? He kind of did what God said, but with his own like little spin on it, right? So then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur. That's a long battle, like right near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the cattle and the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. Look at the edit. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. You see what Saul did? Saul decided to like, yeah, I want to do what God says, but I kind of want to do it with my own thing. I'm going to spare Agag because I need kind of a trophy of what I've done. I want to drag this guy home in defeat and make him an example. I want everybody to see this king, and I want everybody to see that I've benefited the kingdom. My great leadership has brought all these fattened calves in and all this stuff. But you know what? I have no need for all the despised and weak things. I don't have any need for the women and the children and the crappy goats and the stuff. I only want the really good stuff. You see, what Saul did was kind of like what he wanted, what God wanted to do, but really with his own edit. Really did nothing like what God wanted. And here's the deal. Saul forgot one thing, that Samuel and God were buddies, right? They're close. He forgot that Samuel and God talked regularly. So God says, hey, Samuel, you know what's up? You know what Saul did? This is what Saul did, tells him about what Saul did. And Samuel was up all night. He's up all night, angry, upset, just about it, just kind of churning, and he goes to confront Saul with it. And he takes this news to Saul. And Saul, kind of like, hey, what's up, Samuel? Like wasn't expecting to see you. And look at what happened. When Samuel reached Saul, he said, hey, Samuel, it's good to see you. Lord bless you, right? Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. He kind of like, oh boy, what do we do, right? He's like, I got to cover my tracks. So he's like, hey, Samuel, I didn't expect to see you, man. Hey, I did what you asked. I attacked the Amalekites just like God said, and did what he said. And so Samuel knows what's up already, right? And so he asks Saul these like really pointed questions. And he says, but Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? And what is this lowing of cattle I hear? Like he's like, hey, Saul, if you did what God said to do, then why is it I hear like the good sheep making noises? Why is it I hear the cattle, the fattened calves? Why do I hear them? And so that puts Saul back on his heels. He's like, So he has to make some really crappy excuses, right? So he says, hey, I'm glad to see you. Samuel calls him out on his mess, and he's kind of like catching up for excuses. And look at the excuse he makes. He says, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. Those soldiers, I don't know what to do with those guys. I told them to go do their thing, but the soldiers, they brought them from them. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. Samuel, I know you think that, that I didn't do what God said, but what I did was I let them save some stuff, and we're gonna sacrifice it to God later. I just took what God said, and I wanted to upgrade it, right? I wanted to do just a little bit better. And now we're gonna get to the reason I told you all that. Remember earlier on, I was gonna tell you why we talked about Saul being so big, why we talked about him being head and shoulders taller, why we talked about him being so handsome, why we talked about the whole king of Israel, or the whole kingdom of Israel, looking up to Saul, literally, physically looking up at Saul because he's so much bigger than everyone else, and respecting him and valuing him. And here's why I told you that, because of this next verse. You see, Samuel confronted Saul with his mess. Samuel heard his excuses, and he says this to him: stop, Saul. Quit. Listen to what the Lord told me last night. What did he tell you, Samuel? Like, oh boy, what does he know that I haven't told you? And Samuel told him, this is so huge. Although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you as king of Israel. Just pay attention to that for a second. It's so easy to read over this, because every one of us see the insecurity in other people, and we just read it in for ourselves. He says, although you may think little of yourself. Another translation says, although you are small in your own eyes, although you may think little of yourself. Do you see the contrast? Saul was chosen because he's the biggest. He's the one that everybody looks up to in terms of his physical appearance. He's the one everybody looks up to in terms of his stature. Everybody literally looks up to him. Everybody else sees him as big, but although you may think little of yourself. So easy, isn't it, for insecurity to sneak into our stories? Isn't that part of the rear view mirror stuff that we'd want to keep in the rear view? Wouldn't we want to live and put our insecurity behind us? Don't you really wish that that would be the case? But the truth of it is that Saul figured out some way, right, to live out of the pain instead of out of the truth. Isn't that what insecurity is? Insecurity is when our actions, our today, our living, our actual life is driven by the pain of our past rather than by what's truthful. Saul, even though you are small in your own eyes, didn't God make you the leader? Didn't God appoint you? Didn't God give you didn't he elevate you even though you're small in your own eyes? Isn't that the truth for us when the stuff that has happened in our stories, in our rearview mirror, winds up finding its way to our windshield, and when it becomes the story that we tell instead of the life that we want to live, we're driven by what's painful instead of what is truthful. Now I got to be honest with you, that's my story. Now your story probably looks different than mine, reads different than my story. I don't know if it was the bullying that I experienced when I was a little kid. I don't know if it was the sexual abuse when I was a teenager. I don't know if it was the growing up without resources and money. When I was a young person, when I grew up, all those things. I don't know what it was in those things, but it somehow produced in me insecurity. Our enemy, right, took seeds and he watered and nurtured them, right? He quietly kept them safe and grew them, and those seeds of pain became roots of insecurity and live out as fruit in my life. The reality is that it was like the unsuccess or the struggles that I had academically still today make me feel like I'm not smart enough. I'll open up a book and I'll try to read something and understand it. And there's a part of me that somewhere in the back of my mind says, you're not smart enough to understand this. Or maybe it's the insecurity that, like, I'll have a conversation with somebody and they're just trying to help, right? Somebody on our staff just trying to help out and do something to help me out. And my initial reaction is, do you think I'm not smart enough to do this by myself? That's insecurity living out in my actions out of pain instead of out of what is true. None of those things are true, right? Whether maybe it's that part of me that goes, man, you grew up without resources, so maybe that's why I want so badly just to get the newest and latest and greatest and the best toys. Because insecurity screams, and while truth whispers in my life. Now listen, your story looks different than mine. I'm not saying that my story and your story are exactly the same. But the only reason I recognize those roots, those seeds of insecurity grown into roots of insecurity, grown into fruits of insecurity in my life is because I've done the work of it. And I don't really what I wish more than anything is that I could just give you an ABC answer, right? Like, oh, all you got to do is A this and B that and C this, right? Man, I wish I could do that, but the truth of it is that I can't do that for you, because truth is, if I did, it would make your pain that you've experienced insignificant. If I could just give myself an ABC answer, then that means that my problem wasn't all that big of a problem, was it? My insecurity wasn't that significant. So I think that we got to do something, right? We do have to walk out here. I want to give you something. And I want to just tell you this. This is what Journey Church is about. We're not about saying that anybody's arrived. We're all on this journey together. 13 years ago today, like this week, 13 years ago, we launched this church so that we're on this journey together. We're not led by someone who knows all of it together. I don't have my poop in a group, right? I instead am one beggar showing another beggar where to find bread. And so here's what I have to say to you. If you're in your story of insecurity, can I just tell you, it's not an ABC answer. I wish it was. It's going to take work. And what I would suggest to you is this, that the beginning of the path that I'm on starts with this word, identity. It's the same thing that Saul and Samuel had a conversation about. Though you're small in your own eyes, have you not seen what God has placed you to be? And I want you to understand that identity is this. Who I am is not what I see in the mirror. Who I am is who I am sees. Who I am is who God sees. I am is God's favorite way to refer to himself. Who I am is not who I see. Who I am is who I am sees. Now listen, that is a simple, trite, kind of cliched sort of little phrase and I want you to know something. You can't write it down and it won't fix it. You can write it down, but it's not going to fix the problem that you're experiencing. It's going to take work. But my guess is that if you are in the pain that I think you're in the pain that I'm in or was in at different parts of my life, then it'll be worth doing the work. And I know what I'm about to ask of you maybe might be a big step for you. But if you're in as much pain as I'm guessing you're in, you'll be willing to do the work to get past the insecurity, because it's a huge deal. And I want you to know that what I'm asking of you, what might be a next step for you today, might be a lot to ask, but it's reading a book. I think this book was super helpful to me. It's called The Bondage Breaker by Neil Anderson. Take a picture of that, write it down, do whatever you got to do, screenshot it, whatever. The Bondage Breaker by Neil Anderson. It's probably 27, 28 years old now. It's a fantastic book. It's not really about this whole idea, but it's very much about breaking the bondage of insecurity because we haven't understood and ingrained an identity in who God believes we are. Now listen, I wish I wants so desperately to give you more than just go, hey, read this book. I know that's a lot to ask. So I want to give you something that is like tangible, where you can start. And what I would say is that I already told you my top 3 places where my insecurity kind of screams loudest, right? Told you that I feel it in insecurity when I talk to human people, when I feel dumb. I feel like there's insignificance when I'm in a group full of men. I feel like there's this not measuring up because of maybe the income when I was a kid. Let me ask you this. If you just get out a piece of paper and make this as simple as you can, what are the top 3 places where you see your, that should say insecurity, showing up? What are the top 3 places where you see your insecurity showing up? Just list them out. Go, I see it here. I feel it there. I know it's here. It's at work, right? Is that where it's at? Is it at home in your relationship with your spouse or with some friends? Is it at school where you're like, man, always feel like I'm trying to catch up? Write down 3 places. Just keep it to yourself. Write down 3 places where you see your insecurity showing up the most. Let me ask you this question about that. Where are you taking that question? Where you're currently going, this is how I do it. You know what most of us do? Most of us manage our insecurity with our false self. Most of us manage our insecurity by kind of putting a false self over it. When I walk into a group of guys, even though that bullying kind of made me feel very insecure, and even though I'm a fairly large guy, and I walk into a group of men, and I stand there with a group of men, I always feel like I'm the smallest one. Even when I'm not the smallest one, I always feel smaller than everyone else. So what do? I'm not honest about it. Most of the time what I do is I make up for how small I feel with a really big personality, right? And really funny jokes and big grand movements, and I'm the hero of all my own stories, right? And it makes me feel like I'm a little bit more significant. You see what's going on? Is I'm taking my biggest questions of insecurity and I'm trying to manage them with my false self. I bet you do the same thing. You know why I bet that? Because if you don't, you'd be the very first person that I met. We all do it. We all manage our insecurities which is a safe layer of falseness about who we are. And that's exactly what Saul did. Saul did exactly that. He managed his insecurity with his false self. Saul said, oh, you know what I did? I saved those things. You know, the soldiers brought them back, and we decided we were going to sacrifice them to God. What's he doing? He's protecting his insecurity. Even though he feels small in his own eyes, he's protecting his insecurity by manipulating spirituality, trying to make himself feel like, well, I did that because I thought we'd sacrifice those to God now that I'm caught, right? Isn't that what we do? My guess is there's more than one person in this room who manipulates spirituality to make themselves feel more significant. I'll tell you this, there's at least one person on this platform that does it. Manipulates spirituality to make myself feel good. Can I just be real and honest? It's not going to serve you well. Manipulating your life, right? Managing your life with your false self might bring you some immediate comfort, but in long term, it's going to wreck your life. It's what it did to Saul. See, he said that we're going to bring all these things, and he manipulated spirituality, and Samuel's response to him was pretty pointed. He said, what's more important? This is Samuel talking. What's more important to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering of the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness is as bad as worshiping idols. Look at what it says. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. You see, that moment of manipulating spirituality made Saul feel better for a second. He's like, oh, I don't feel so insecure. But it ruined his life. You see, it didn't just cost him he wasn't removed as king that day. God let him live out the rest of his life as king of Israel, because that's not the kingship he really took from him. The kingship he took from him wasn't his kingship, it was his legacy. See, that as the king, he would be right to pass it on to his son Jonathan. pass it on to his son's son. And that's a big deal, right? Maybe Jonathan got robbed in the deal, but understand this. What Saul lost was more significant than a kingship, and it's more significant than passing it down to his son. Have you ever heard Jesus referred to as having been born in the city of David? The city of David is because David is the lineage through which Jesus came. God brought the Christ, Jesus Christ, through the lineage of the king of Israel. And it's not Saul because of this moment. That God chose to take away that future opportunity because he couldn't get past his past. Isn't that how it is for us? When the objects in the rear view don't stay in the rear view, instead they sneak up into our future, the objects of yesterday steal our potential for tomorrow. That's the reality, is that managing insecurity with your false self, it offers some short-term relief, but in the long run, it wrecks your life. It wrecks Saul's life. Not just the life he lives, but the more important life, the life of his legacy. Can I just, without putting too fine a point on it before we land the plane, can we just talk about this? That you managing your past insecurity with your false self, whether that's the big bravado, right? Or the loud sense of humor like mine, or whether it's the anger that you're managing with, or the potential or the tendency to keep people at arm's length, or even just your inability to be real and raw and emotional or honest with your family, it won't just ruin your life. It'll ruin your family's life. It'll ruin your legacy. Can I just tell you that I know that the next steps I've offered are not simple. Reading the book, walking in a truth of identity, listing out the 3 most significant places where my insecurity shows up, and asking myself if I'm really taking my question to my false self or to someone else, and really walking in that's not simple. Man, I wish I could just give you an ABC answer. But if I did, if I gave you an ABC answer, if I gave you a simple 3-step process, it wouldn't make very much of the significant pain, the significant insecurity that you and I and every person in this group of people feel. Because it's real. And I'll be honest with you. The God of the universe came to earth so that you could have a rich and satisfying, abundant life. And this insecurity is stealing it from you.